Hello and welcome. I'm here with everyone's favorite Bible scholar, at least as far as my audience goes, Dale Allison. Welcome back. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself for those who didn't catch the last interview about a year ago that I did with you on your book on the resurrection?
Okay, well, I'm a New Testament scholar and I teach at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I've worked primarily on early Christian history, early Jewish history, and I suppose I'm best known for doing stuff on Jesus, maybe the Gospel of Matthew, and some so-called intertestamental Jewish texts. But what you're going to talk to me about today is off the beaten path, or at least my beaten path, is something different than what I've done before.
So this was actually my first question about the book, which is Encountering Mystery, that we're going to be talking about. And that is why write this book, because you sort of have this opening chapter where you say, this is very different from the kind of scholarship that you're usually doing on the New Testament. And maybe it delves a bit more into the apologetics realm, or maybe it delves a bit more into, almost like a personal interest or personal testimony type thing. So I don't know, what are your thoughts as the author about that?
Okay, so the way this works is this is a book I've always wanted to write. So when I write an academic tome on the Gospel of Matthew or Jesus, you usually don't see much of the real person. I'm using academic language and academic arguments, and for a lot of it, you could really ask, well, so what, or who cares? That's really true. This is a book I've wanted to write for a long time, but I was afraid to do so. So actually, a couple of parts of this I wrote in the 1990s. But when I wrote them, I did not have a full-time job in the field. I was not tenured. I was not a full professor. I did not have a chair, and so on. And I decided to write this after I'd finally reached a stage in my career where I don't care any longer what other people think of me. So it's sort of like they can't fire me at this point, right? I've got job security. And I also have if I may say so, I have a decent reputation within the academic field. And so the worst that could happen is some people are going to say, well, Allison used to be sane and a good scholar, or this is just an aberration within the larger corpus. But for me, it's actually foundational to the corpus, because religious experiences, which is what this book about, are actually what led me into this field in the first place. I had an overwhelming, whatever you want to call it, rapture, mystical experience. And it's what got me interested in talking about God and looking at religion. And part of that was looking at the Bible and trying to figure out what the heck this thing is about. So the way I view it, I'm actually going back to the original impulse that's behind all the academic scholarship I've done. And if I'm being honest with people, this book, or at least parts of it, are what lie behind this impulse to figure out what religious texts are about.
So with respect to sort of being the idea of being like scared about authoring a book like this, if it's not too personal to explore, because I think it's a theme that comes up sort of throughout the book, where you say you think maybe a lot of people have had these sorts of experiences that you're kind of documenting, or something like them, and maybe themselves feel sort of too scared to talk about them in their religious communities and things. I'm just wondering, is that because of this idea that there might be like ridicule behind that, or that it wouldn't be taken seriously by people?
Yeah, that's everywhere. Once people hear me say a few things that indicate I won't laugh at them or that I'll listen to their story, I will hear odd things, and they are very often prefaced by, I've never told anyone else this before, or I've only told my husband, that sort of thing. I've seen this with my own family. My own daughter had this very bizarre experience once, and she told me about it right after it happened, but she told me I couldn't tell anyone else. And the line I remember was, they'll think I'm crazy. Okay. So part of what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to show that a number of mystical or visionary or religious experiences are pretty common. They're not confined to Christians. They're not confined to religious people. and they do not, in and of themselves, tell you anything about somebody's mental state. So there's been a tradition of sort of pathologizing or medicalizing the experiences I talk about in the book. And I'm pushing back and simply saying a lot of these things happen to human beings, and that's it. That's a fact. We need to acknowledge it. And secondly, it does not mean you have mental debility or you're schizophrenic or so on. So every single member of my immediate family has had a vision which they did not experience as a hallucination, and which they ended up taking seriously and pondering and trying to figure out what the heck that was. And none of us needs to be seen by a psychologist for this reason, or a shrink for this reason, and we don't need to be treated with drugs. Maybe we have other problems, but these actually aren't among them. These are not our problems. These are just things that happen to us. And I think of the book as just being honest and saying, look, these things go on. So first of all, no matter how you interpret them, they just happen. And you need to know that, because that's just part of the world. You turn on the news to find out what's going on in the world. You read this book to find some other things that are going on in the world. And beyond that, you can't dismiss them simply on grounds of mental instability and just say, yeah, no, this person is crazy. Now, of course, there's a place to discuss the neuroscience of our brains and all the rest of it. And it may well be that a reader of my book says, no, I don't believe in any transcendence at all. That's actually fine with me. My point would be, don't be condescending about these experiences that matter to people, and that, in my experience, most often they don't ask for, they don't seek, they just happen to people. So I'm not talking in this book about drug experiences, for example. Those are very interesting, and those are worth talking about. And I'm not talking about religious rituals that can lead you to a certain state of mind. You know, this is not about whirling dervishes and that sort of thing. This is just about ordinary people and things they say happened to them when they weren't looking for them to happen.
So I suppose, sort of initially, then, to preface the talk of like any of these individual experiences, sort of more broadly, what do you mean by a religious experience, or perhaps a mystical experience?
Yeah.
And even words like hallucination, that might be used, or illusion.
Yeah. So this is all very, very difficult. What I do in the book is look at experiences that, for many people who have them, are religious. That is, they will put the word religion onto them, or they will put the word God onto them, or they'll interpret it in Christian terms or Islamic terms or Jewish terms, or whatnot. So I'm looking at experiences that the people themselves who experience them think have something to do with theology or God or religion. And this is a hodgepodge. It's a mess. And I say at the end, all I've done is give a selection of things. But I've looked at mystical raptures where people think they've been surrounded by some sort of transcendent love. I've talked about the real common, surprisingly very common experience of just ordinary people, including secular people, who are just going through life and all of a sudden think that they've run into some evil force or oppressive power that they can't see usually, but they're just overwhelmed by this. I look at these really uncritical, for the most part, books on angels that have been so popular for the last 3 or more decades. And I go through them and I say, okay, these are people talking about what happened to them. Can we see patterns here? Is there anything interesting here more than folklore and how legends develop and how people exaggerate things? And I say, well, maybe there is. But angel stories consist of all sorts of different phenomena, like hearing voices or seeing a figure of light or being guided, felt like you're guided to do something, or falling over, but you don't fall over and you get rescued by invisible hands and so on. So there are a bunch of things, and people then stick the category angel on it for various reasons having to do with our culture. So if you look at these books, there are actually a dozen different sorts of things going on, but they all get lumped together under angel, right? And some of these experiences, I try to be, I am critical of much of this, but people are saying this happened to me, and I think it had something to do with God or Christ or whatnot. I also look at experiences surrounding deathbeds, which are very interesting. Lots of people think that they see dead relatives at their deathbeds, and this is a phenomenon that's being studied intensively actually right now. Then there are, of course, near-death experiences, and one of the common things about them is that people who talk about them frequently, more often than not, actually will use the word God or whatever the word God is in their culture. They think it has something to do with the ultimate transcendent something. So these are some of the experiences I talk about in this book. Also, there's a chapter on prayer, which is less on extraordinary experiences than the inner terrain that people create when they pray. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that, at least in my circles, my religious circles, children are told they should pray, or they somehow pick up that they're told to pray, but they're rarely given any instructions on the details. And so we all fill this out in really different and fascinating ways. And so this chapter is an attempt to, among other things, to explore not just the psychology of prayer, but the imaginative maps that we make when we are interceding or attempting to intercede for other people. So again, it's a bunch of different stuff, but it's held together by the fact that many of the people who do these things think of them as religious. Of course, I'm leaving that undefined here, or associate it with God. Of course, there are different understandings of that word, but they are thinking that these experiences have something to do with more than mundane reality, or what you usually see and hear about you, or hear people talk about ordinarily.
So I kind of have a list of questions that delve into some of these topics, but the first one is going to be around prayer. So you've kind of outlined there some of the things that you're doing in that chapter on prayer. And I guess, I thought you were about to say something. But I guess my question then would be something along the lines of, what are the kind of theistic conclusions that you want to draw out about prayer? So are you trying to sort of prescribe to people who already believe in this you're shaking your head, so presumably not, or maybe to suggest to people who sign up to some kind of theology what might be going on in prayer to help them, but then just kind of leave it on the table if people disagree, or are you trying to make a stronger argument or something?
No. In this chapter, I'm making a weaker argument. I actually am saying, let's stand back. Let's ask people what they're doing when they engage in this activity that they stick the word prayer on. And then more particularly, let's ask them what they are doing when they say they are praying for other people, or, asking for God's blessing on this person or that person. And I'm just saying, this is really interesting, and I don't know of a literature on it. I really don't. There's a lot of literature on the psychology of prayer and how prayer, even if there is no God, works as a self-therapy. It connects you to other people. It makes you less selfish. You imagine this beneficent presence with you. So there are all sorts of ways in which the psychologists have been looking at prayer, but I've just been asking people, what are you doing? What do you think you're accomplishing? And how does it, what do you see when you close your eyes? And most people in our time and place, or at least the ones I talk to, close their eyes. And they go off into what I think is rightly called an imaginative realm. And I've discovered the imaginative realms of people are very, very different. They are not the same. And I've also discovered they're affected by technology. So I know that at one point in the book, I talked to a woman who says she always prays by putting her hand up here because she's talking to God is like talking on the telephone. I had a student once who told me that he prays the game of Tetris. I don't know if you know Tetris, but it's a falling, these colors and little shapes and so on. You fit them into the bottom, into the slots. He said that's how he prays. So he's taken a game that he learned and obviously loves, and he somehow figured out how to put names on the falling tiles and slot them into places, and this is how it works. Or again, just asking people, when you pray for another person, what do you see? Do you see a face? Do you see a still picture, a live picture? Do you see the shoulders? You see the whole thing. Some people I've discovered see little kind of 5-second videos of full-bodied figures. Most people actually are seeing what I see now when I look at you. They're seeing headshots, right? They're seeing headshots. And then I've discovered other people don't see headshots. They actually are looking at God or a representation of God. So they're looking at light, or they're looking at a blank space, or they're looking at stars. Or one person I found actually said, well, I pray to the letters G-O-D. That's really interesting. I talked to another woman who said she'd spent her whole life praying to her grandfather. She put her grandfather on a throne, and that's where she went in her imagination when she said her prayers. So I think this is all just interesting. I'm not prescribing anything here. And in fact, when we get to, in this chapter, the section on what do you think we're accomplishing when we pray, I just say, I'm not quite sure what the heck is going on. It's just natural for me. I'm a religious guy. Prayer, has always been there. I started when I was really young. I've got kids, and, I have friends dying of cancer. It's just not possible not to think about them in some way that, I don't know, helps me with my helplessness, because I can't cure cancer. I can't guard my kids at all time and places. It's just, it's a very human thing to do. And this is also obvious because, as far as I know, every culture of the world has some sort of prayer or varieties of prayer or intercession and that sort of thing. So even if you dismiss it all, even if you think it's all superstition, people are still doing it. And it's still interesting to look in their heads, I think, or their imaginations and say, what's going on? What are they really doing when they do this? So there's nothing prescriptive. I don't think there's anything prescriptive in that chapter.
Something I also really appreciated was the sort of honesty with which you were describing, your personal strugglings with prayer as well. So, when you said that you sort of just couldn't assent to this idea of like petitionary prayer having an influence in the light of, like some kind of like instances of evil and things like that you'd grappled with where prayer hadn't done anything, and you just couldn't really make sense of those, and it wasn't an I thought that was very, very honest, but interesting that prayer still plays this role for you kind of in light of those things.
So actually, at some place in the book, I go on to talk about I guess what you would call the limits of reason within religion. And so I do things that I could not defend rationally to an atheist. I couldn't say, well, obviously I do this for these reasons. The reasons are personal and psychological, and I'm not sure what to do with them philosophically. I should say that there's a story which I don't tell in this book, but there's a story behind my skepticism here. So my father was a wonderful person, and he was sort of a New Age Christian, had his own theology, but he took really seriously Jesus is saying, that if you have faith, you can do anything. You can move a mountain, right? And at the last part of his life, he was in a horrible place. as bad a place as you could be for somebody who'd lived a really good and decent life. And he kept praying. And we had these conversations. I said, Dad, prayer doesn't work like this. It just doesn't. And what he kept trying to do was he tried to psych himself into having faith, because Jesus talked about faith. And so if he could get to that state of mind, he could actually get his prayers answered. And of course, things just got worse and worse and worse. He ended up with brain cancer, and the IRS confiscated his house. It was just completely miserable. And at the end of his life, he said some things to me that made me think, you know what, maybe this was all just an illusion, because he had sort of boiled his religion down to, okay, if I have faith, I'll get what I'm asking for. And it didn't work. And he just died a broken person, right? In complete misery. And so that's my least favorite saying of Jesus. I don't, I'm anxious to demythologize it or do something with it other than what my dad did with it.
I suppose something I'm finding interesting is like, it seems like there's a difference between maybe personality types or something, like myself and you when it comes to this, because I don't know the way. So just today, for example, right? I'm taking job interviews, and I think, and I think, oh, like, oh God, it'd be really nice if I got that interview. Now, I consider myself an atheist and a naturalist. I'm like, well, that's a weird, interesting impulse. I don't think it's doing anything, but then my experiences, with cases like you sort of just mentioned, it for me, it's almost like Christianity builds a theory or something about the way the world's going to work, and there are predictions and things built into that. And then they don't come true, and when they don't, in my experience, that kind of disconfirms it. But it seems like it's not doing that for you in the same way. And I'm just wondering, or maybe it is doing that for you in the same way. I'm just wondering what you think that difference might be between the two. Why is it that those experiences for me make me think, well, probably something like naturalism is true as an alternative. But
I see. Well, okay.
My faith or my religious commitment is just something different than this kind of like.
Yeah. So I don't have what the Reformed tradition calls I don't have a strong belief in what the Reformed tradition calls providence. I have a really weak view of providence, and I actually like Origin. Origin just says God made the world and has given everything freedom, all rational creatures. I think the whole creation is free. Now you can ask why and what's the good of that and blah blah blah, but it's just the world that I see, which is full of evil, and I can't possibly think that God is or the God that I want to believe in, or that I do believe in, is somehow in charge of the details of this place. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I guess I gave that up a long time ago.
Well, I get, so maybe, the way that I sort of think about it would be, I don't know, I can't understand like reasons a God would have to create a world like that. If there's and a point in time is perhaps misleading language, but if there's a point, if there's a state sans creation, let's say, where there's a kind of perfect being, or maybe not perfect being, but at least, a God that's presumably not a state where there aren't all these evils and things. I just struggle to understand why a God would bring about a state of affairs that's free in that way, where these things would happen, I think.
So, I mean, I think that's already in the Bible. So the book of Job just says we don't get what's happening here, and we're like Job, and all these things are going on, and he didn't cause this. But the other thing is that the New Testament, at least the Old Testament's moving here, Hebrew Bible's moving here, but the New Testament has a lot of eschatology in it, right? In some sense, I think it's otherworldly. And it's otherworldly because it believes in a good God. And if it believes in a good God, it cannot reconcile that with the world as it is. It cannot imagine this world goes on like this forever. So it has to posit that God wins in the end. Now, that doesn't solve the philosophical problem of why are we here in the first place, but it's sort of an existential solution. This isn't going to be like this forever. There's something better. And of course, the other side of this is the side in this book. So whatever you make of history, which is a a god-awful mess. I can't, it's just terrible. History is terrible. But then there are people, there are saints, and then there are just ordinary Joes like me who have these raptures and these encounters, and we don't say, well, that was just a chemical, mistake. We say, we think we just ran into something that's behind the scenes or underneath or beyond, and it's real. One of the odd things here, and the neuroscientists are studying this. They're trying to figure out triggers and so on. But a lot of the experiences I talk about in the book, and 2 or 3 that I've had, they come with this sense that this is really real, and that actually the ordinary world isn't real. It's like it flips, right? And so we're used to saying, well, people have visions, and that's hallucination in the derogatory sense. What's really real is I have a desk here, right? And I'm going to eat supper tonight, and so on. But in the middle of these experiences, it's like, it's like Plato's cave. That's exactly what it is. It's like I've spent my whole life in Plato's cave, and I just got a glimpse of the real thing that's beyond it. And the real thing that is beyond it in many cases for many people is some sort of loving, reassuring, transcendent, graceful, whatever. And how you put this all together? Well, if I don't put it all together. I just think I have a mammalian brain, as I say in the book. I'm a mammal, and I look around, and I don't think any other mammals can figure out the world, right? They can't think gigantic thoughts and encompass everything. So I think I'm a mammal, and that helps me. So I see contradictory things that I can't put together, and I just say I'm a dog. I'm just like my dog Ralph. That's it. So that's not going to satisfy an atheist, because that's going to look like a rationalization. But from my point of view, it makes perfect sense.
So the second topic, which you have already touched on as well, are these experiences of angels, which, and as you say, you're kind of collating a whole bunch of different kind of stories and evidences and putting them together. And then I'm just wondering how it is that you kind of synthesize that, given, like your commitments. Is it like, are you saying that some of these are veridical, or that they indicate something, or just that they're interesting? And
so first of all, above all, these books on angels purport to give us human testimony. And in a number of these books, people are just quoted. Some of them, they just reproduce letters that people wrote, or emails, or whatnot. So this is alleged human experience. I find that interesting. I also find this interesting as a biblical scholar, because the concept of an angel in Western culture comes from the Bible. And in the Bible, angels do several things. And then in our culture, when a number of things happen, we say angels. So, for example, if you're in the hospital ward and you're suffering, and in the middle of the night, somebody dressed in white comes in, a nurse, and helps you, and gets you through the night, and then leaves. And then, of course, if you ask the next morning, right, well, who was this? Oh, there was no nurse on your floor last night, and nobody looks like that. Then the person is going to say angel, right? Because that's a category we have. It actually goes back to Genesis 18, where Abraham entertains angels unaware. They're there and he doesn't know it, and then they leave, and his eyes are opened, and so on. Or again, these books have anti-gravity stories in them, and I try to be critical. I spend several pages analyzing a couple of them and saying, not really, this isn't going to convince me. But again, I think it's influenced by Matthew 4 and Luke 4. So there's a psalm where God will carry you up, or buoy you up, or lift you up with the angels, right? And the Satan says to Jesus, throw yourself off the temple, and he quotes the psalm, right? The angels will grab you. And so what happens in our culture, or a lot of it, is when people have these stories where gravity, they think, has been defeated. They're thinking, oh, it must be an angel. So these books have the anti-gravity stories, and then they have the the what I call AIW stories, the angel in white stories, right? But then they also have the visionary stories, and whatever you make of it, and this is worldwide. This is not Christian. This is not Jewish. This is not Bible. People do have these visions of luminous humanoid figures. They're fairly common, right? And they often show up in near-death experiences, but they're just common otherwise. And so when people in our culture have those experiences, they say, oh, it must be an angel. So that's what's happening in these books. When you go through them, you can do a sort of a what I call form critical analysis. You can say, okay, here are these types of stories. Here are these stories. Here are these stories. And here are the ways in which I think biblical motifs are informing how the culture construes and interprets these experiences, and how the culture, religious culture, actually instantly tells some experiencers, oh, that's what this is. One of my favorite things in this book is this woman who one night saw this incredible light. All right, the whole house was overwhelmed by this light, and it terrifies her. And the first thing she thinks, I suppose because she's seen a couple of movies, is maybe it was a UFO in the backyard. Okay. But then she thinks, oh, maybe it's Jesus, because, he's full of light. And then she thinks, oh, maybe it was lightning. And then she goes out and talks to her mother, who was in the backyard. Anyway, she goes through 4 or 5 of these possibilities, and she finally says Jesus. But it shows you the ambiguity of the experience, that in her telling of it, she runs through, I think, at least 4 different interpretive possibilities. She calls up NASA or the local Air Force base and says, do we have any unusual lights in the sky tonight? That kind of thing. So the experiences in themselves are often ambiguous, and then people throw this tag on them, and that's where the angel books come from. And some of the angel books actually sort themselves into chapters, right? This type of story, and this type of story. So I have to be an open-minded person, because I've experienced some really weird things. So I do, in that chapter, say, well, you know what? If this story occurred exactly as narrated, well, this would be interesting and would be truly puzzling. But most of these aren't like that. They're just testimonies from individuals about odd things, and they say angel.
So pretty much everything that you said there, I can definitely agree with as a naturalist, or I describe myself as a naturalist. So I'm wondering, is there anything extra that you wanted to say, about these being kind of like indicative or better explained under theism or something like that? Or...
No, I don't know. No, I wouldn't say that the experiences in that chapter are better explained in terms of theism. I would say that if 2 or 3 of these stories happened as narrated, they raise possibilities. So there is a story from a woman who says, now that's it. I don't know her. I'm not investigated. I can't tell you anything more than she said that there was a train track behind her house. And one day she walked out onto the backyard, and her toddler had left the backyard and had crawled up onto the railroad track. And a train was coming. All right. And she looked, and she realized she didn't have enough time to get there before the train would come. So her story is that out of the blue, she saw a luminous being, and that this being lifted her son off the track. The train went by, and then her son was unharmed on the other side. Okay. Now, I'm not telling you this happened, and I wasn't there. But I would say that if that happened to me, I would probably say angel. I don't know what an atheist would do if that happened to an atheist, but it might give an atheist pause for thought. You might think, well, maybe I hallucinated and my child just fell off the track. I mean, you might be able to do something. The more interesting stories are those where more than one person, sees allegedly a glorious figure who does something. Again, if those stories are true, then you have something to think about. But those aren't the dominant story, right? Most of them are individuals seeing something, so that a naturalist can just throw the the always useful word hallucination at it, right? A hallucination, So it's kind of like angels. Christians throw angels on lots of things, while other people throw hallucination on tons of things.
And a final just thought on this particular topic that I had when I was reading it was, this kind of emphasis you put on maybe if more people talked about it, then people would feel less, I don't know what the right word is, but maybe like less ashamed to talk about these sort of things. And
yeah.
I think there was a part of me as I read that kind of worried that if that sort of thing did happen, that might be a lot of people who would postulate kind of like demonic explanations for things, like for political disagreement. Well, the party I disagree with, they're all possessed by demons, right? And so we've got to do something spiritual about that, or they shouldn't be treated like and there's a side to that maybe like practically worries me a little bit. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So yes, I don't like people who posit demons as explanations for everything that happens. And I have known such people. I knew a woman once who had a backache and she attributed it to Satan, right? So I didn't attribute her backache to Satan, and I thought she should get a heating pad and put some Bengay on it or something. But no, that's a dangerous thing. And if you look historically, that's what many Christians have done. When you have an enemy, you demonize, and that can be literal. So Martin Luther really thinks that the Pope is somehow the see of Satan, and it's not a metaphor. He really thinks it. And for me, that's sad and miserable and a horrible part of our tradition. And when I talk to people about this, one of the things I like to point out is that in the Gospels, at least in Matthew and Luke, no, all three synoptics, Jesus is actually acknowledged by his opponents as an exorcist. He actually did this, but then the explanation is, well, it must be Beelzebul, right? It must be a satanic force. And then Justin, it's kind of ironic that Christians then do the same thing to everybody else that Jesus's opponents did to him. So we don't like it when it's done to Jesus. I don't think we should like it when it's done to anybody. That's my view. And I have some tentative thoughts about evil in this book, but I'm very circumspect, and I am keenly aware that Satan has been a rhetorical weapon throughout church history, and it's a horrible thing.
So another thing that you talk about in the book are near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, and how these are sort of another subcategory of these kind of experiences that people might ascribe the label of being religious to. So I wondered if you just wanted to kind of talk about what some of these are, and maybe list some of your favorites and why they're interesting to you in this book.
Okay, well, I've been interested in these ever since they hit the public awareness in the 1970s with the publication of a book called Life After Life by a man named Raymond Moody. They've always interested me. I suppose in part because, notwithstanding my religious convictions, I have been very afraid of death, or was for a very long time, and so I wanted some kind of empirical support for my religious convictions. But by now, almost everyone in our culture knows what an NDE is, or a near-death experience. There was a time when they didn't. It's kind of like Roswell. I mean, there was a time when only UFO weirdos knew what Roswell was, and now everybody in the universe knows it. So that's what happened with near-death experiences in the 70s and then in the 80s. So the stereotypical picture is that you are near death, and you feel yourself rise out of your body, and you're above your body, and you look down, so you're seeing yourself from a ceiling or from up somewhere. And then you go down, in Western accounts at least, a tunnel, and there's a light at the end. Then you meet a being of light, and then often you have a life review, and then there's something like a point in which you are sent back, or you make a decision. I'm not going on. I'm going to go back. So there are two things that have impressed me when I'm looking at these experiences. There are many, many things to think about here, but one is I have talked to experiencers themselves, and I had a friend once who was dying, and had surgery, and told me afterwards. He said, I've always thought NDEs were near death experiences were bunk. He said, I just had one, and I know it's not bunk. I remember being on a panel with a philosopher, and we were done. He was anti NDE. I was open minded about them. And a guy came up from the back and talked to my debating partner for a long, long time. And then he came over to me, and I said, what were you talking about? You talked to this guy for a long time. And he said, I just told him he didn't know what he was talking about, because I've had one, I've been there, and I know. So when you talk to a few people like that, it's really interesting, because either they are utterly deluded, they've had an experience which is utterly convincing and it's false. And that's scary if that's where human psychology is. You can be so deluded as to be certain that this happened, uh, or maybe there's something to it. And the other thing that I find interesting, and I gave, I don't know, about 10 examples of this book, because I wanted to push it. So there is occasionally in this book, as you know, as I'm sure you recognize, occasional pushback towards modern materialistic reductionistic accounts. It's not what the theme of the book is. And I think you might have used the word apologetics. I think it's apologetics light. And it is not even Christian apologetics. It's just maybe we should take some of these things seriously. But one of the things that has impressed me is that there are quite a few now. There are lots. And there's actually now a whole book which just collects them, of testimony from on the scene medical attendants, surgeons, emergency personnel, nurses, and so on, who were in the place where the person was, who was unconscious or in surgery, and so on. And the person then will wake up and say, well, I saw this, or you did that, etc. Or I saw you down the hall talking to so-and-so, and you had mustard on your tie, that kind of thing. And my question is, you can't do anything with one testimony like this, but what if you get testimony after testimony after testimony from doctors, some of whom say, I have no explanation for this, or I'm skeptical, or whatever? How many do you need before you at least ask, is there something unusual going on here? Not even proof of an afterlife, but just, is it possible that there is veridical perception that is happening without the normal, eyes, ears, and so on? And I leave it up in the air. I ask the question. I say, how much testimony do we need? Maybe we're getting there. So I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'm not an expert on hallucinations. But I have known a couple of people who've spent their lives studying near-death experiences, who think that they point to something beyond. And so I think we should take them seriously. So again, this is not a work of apologetics, but I'm trying to help people have an open mind. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough because I agree with you. Like of the cases that you list and like ones that I've looked into, they certainly are interesting. Just from like a that's a weird thing that
Yeah.
people are experiencing point of view.
Uh-huh.
Um, I guess I I tend to see in the kind of it there's few apologists who kind of focus on these experiences,
Uh-huh.
and I tend to see it's more like this kind of like psi phenomena community who are into some of these things,
Uh-huh.
but oftentimes I think there's a focus on criticizing the kind of proposed natural explanations of what's going on. But then I think very little emphasis is put on proposing like a non-natural alternative. And what I think when I've tried to understand like what might be going on from a non-natural alternative,
Mm-hmm.
I really struggled to understand what the explanation even would be. So take the example of like remote viewing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if we imagine like Cartesian souls or something that can see, but they can see from points in space absent, the apparatus of the eyes and things like that.
Uh-huh.
It raises a bunch of questions for me, like why did we evolve eyes in the first place if the soul could
Yeah. Oh,
see
yeah.
and things like
No.
that, right? And it just means that I struggle with because I don't know that there is like an alternative to the kind of natural. And I wondered if there's anything there, or if you just kind of are willing to leave it at, well, this is weird, and I get, but it's
Uh,
not like evidence in favor of a particular sort of supernatural view of what's going on.
I don't think so. So a couple of times in this book, what I'll say is this is consistent with theism, but it doesn't point to any particular religion or any specific conclusion, and that's the case for everything, including near death experiences. Um, I look. I think you're right that philosophically these experiences, if some of them are veridical, raise really difficult questions that have not been answered. I don't know if they can be answered, right? So everything about us says we learn through the eyes, and we learn through touch, and we learn through taste, and we learn through our ears, and so on. And what sense does it make to say those have shut down, and the brain is not as active as it was, or maybe it's not showing any brain waves at all, and people are having these incredible experiences and even perceiving something they think veridically? Uh, there is no explanation for that, except what I would do is say that there's uh, if this is true, it raises the possibility of something, and here's my weasel word, my hedge word, something analogous to a soul. I don't know what that means, right? I've toyed with all sorts of things. There are Indian philosophers and old Hindu texts where there isn't something like a Cartesian soul, but there's something like more than one body inside of you. And how does this work? So the truth is, I've never figured out how any of this could work. I kind of embarrassingly uh, reproduced some of the thoughts of William James over two or three pages on how he could think of the possibility of consciousness surviving death. But that's rerunning um, an old way of looking at things that uh, I find attractive, but I see no way to establish it or to demonstrate it. And certainly to somebody who starts from a different point of view, they're not going to go there. Um, the best I can do is talk, and I have done this, is to talk to some real neuroscientists and ask them what they think about these things. And I have yet to meet one. I know they are there, but I have yet to meet one who says, yeah, what I do can only be understood in terms of reductive materialism. I haven't heard that from them. Actually, what I've sometimes heard is, all the stuff I do, I don't think it has anything to do with what you're talking about. It's just a completely, I just work with brains. It has nothing to do with death or an afterlife, or even understanding consciousness. Because anyway, so I'm rambling a bit there, but I hope I don't come across in the book as thinking I know a lot. I hope I come across as somebody who is open minded and curious, and think some of these things are truly surprising, given my education anyway, right? And that they need to be looked at, and people who have such experiences should not be, dismissed. There's one woman in this book I talk about who had this mystical rapture where she saw a figure of light and it radiated love. And she claimed this went on for a long, long, long time. And she shared it with her minister, and the minister was very uneasy. And he said, well, maybe it has something to do with menopause. So that's the sort of thing I hate, just simple, uninformed dismissals that are reductionistic. I don't like that. It's not taking people seriously or being pastoral or kind from any point of view.
So the last couple of chapters in the book are kind of reflective, I suppose, of everything else that's written in the previous chapters. So I have a few questions which I've kind of encompassed under the theological issues. So something that I thought was interesting was you talked about experiences that people have, or that even you yourself have had, which almost don't fit in the Christian paradigm, or better fit in some kind of alternative religious paradigm. And I was wondering if you wanted to kind of talk about those, and then how you square that away with still having Christian commitments as well.
I don't. So look, I consistency is not. Yeah, it's not possible. I can't figure things out. So I do share in the book that I once had this experience that all is one, and it was overwhelming, and it was real, and I was convinced in the moment. And I knew enough Hinduism at the time. I'd study Hindu texts. As soon as the experience was gone, I knew that this was that I was Brahman, and Brahman was me, and all was one. And then I said, oh, but I'm a Christian. And then I really did say, well, that's really interesting. And then as I thought about it, I thought, well, you know what? I think this experience probably lies behind this religious conviction or this religious doctrine. And I've discovered since that's a really common experience. It happens all over the place. When it happens within a religious framework, which says all is one, or you are that, then it supports it, it buoys it up, it reinforces it. If it takes place outside of a framework that doesn't have that thought, all is one, then you just forget it, or you say, that was interesting, as I did, or I also just filed it away. I didn't forget it, but I filed it away saying, I'm not quite sure what to do with that from my Christian point of view. But that experience is real. It happens. If philosophers or theologians want to do something with it, then they should do something with it. But, I've spent my time on other things. But there's no virtue in being dishonest, right? Again, when you talk about visions, you have to acknowledge that if Christians see Jesus, or if they see Jesus, then if you're Protestant, you have to admit that Catholics see Mary, right? What do you do with that? And if you're a Catholic, if you're Catholic or Protestant, you have to acknowledge that people see Krishna. They have visions of Krishna, or what they call Krishna. So you need to be honest up front with that. And then you can think about what this means. My own tendency is to think that we need to take seriously what modern scientists are saying about perception, and how much of it is projection, and how much of it is filling in the blanks, and so on. I think there's a lot to do there, and we don't have to be simple-minded about this. But the first thing we have to do is we have to honor people's reports and experiences. And you're right, Christians don't always do that.
So I know you don't want to be prescriptive at all, so I kind of struggling with how to word this question. It's something like, what would you want people to take away if they if they themselves are kind of processing religious experiences, you know. So without maybe being too prescriptive, is there something that you would want people who might have had?
So part of this book is partly written because I found too many people who feel alone. So this happened to them and they think they're the only one. And it's ridiculous because this experience is happening to tons of other people. So that's part of what I'm trying to do here, to say you're not alone. This is actually really common. Um, so the experience of running into an evil presence or invisible demonic force or whatever you want to call it, we know from surveys that at least 1 in 5 people in North America, which is where I am, we know that at least 1 in 5 people have this experience over the course of a lifetime. But when people have it, they don't know that fact. That is, they're thinking, oh my gosh, have I done something wrong and there's a demon in my room, right? Or Satan's out to get me, or maybe I'm cracking up, or something like that. They need to be told, first of all, or they need to know, first of all, this is a human experience. It is not most often, actually rarely, associated with mental debility or mental disease. It's just something that happens to human beings. So that's the first thing. People feel good when they know that what has happened to them is not aberrant, that it's actually pretty common. All right. So that's not prescriptive, but it is, I go pastoral. Maybe that's it. So these experiences are going on. We need to recognize that they go on, and we should not be condescending about them. Now, there is a place for critical discussion, and some of it's in the book. And if you and I don't know where, I don't even know where you are. This is just.
I'm in Glasgow at the minute, but I'm trying to get to London. So.
I like Glasgow. I was there. I lived there for a short period of time. Anyway, so if I was a Glaswegian, we could go out for some beer tonight. We could talk about these things really critically, right? That would be fine. But there's another part of life where people have experiences and they're worried about them and they don't know what to make of them. And so my hope is that a book like this helps some religious leaders or some clergy or some people to be more open-minded and less dismissive and less condescending and less defensive. I mean, so regarding theological issues, I suppose the burden of this book is to say, just lighten up. Come on. We have lots of uptight people, and if something happens and it doesn't immediately fit their theology or support their theology, they want to do everything to get rid of it. And I think that's just really self-centered. I think it's narcissistic and self-serving and uninformed. So that's where I'm going. If that's prescriptive, okay, that part's prescriptive.
So my last question for you then would just be, what have you learned or taken away from writing this book? What would be like the main kind of like area that you've grown or learned from like, as you said, writing this since the 90s, which I didn't know.
Yeah, well, parts of it when I was too afraid to publish it. Of course, it's all been updated. Look, I'll give you the the self-serving answer. First of all, it was just fun to do this, to get away from my normal work. So I don't know how much. I think I did learn some things about near-death experiences that I didn't know before. And I learned some more about terminal lucidity that I didn't know before. So terminal lucidity is that really weird phenomenon where somebody who's been unconscious or completely out of it or had dementia or Alzheimer's for months or years kind of wakes up for a last conversation or a last goodbye. It's finally being studied seriously because people have recognized that it's a real phenomenon. I didn't know about some of the recent work done on it. But look, I had so much fun writing this book that if it does well, I'm going to write a sequel. If it doesn't do well, I guess I'll just go back to writing about Jesus and Matthew and all these other things. And, because people are interested in what I have to say about those things. But if it does well, I'll think about writing some more, because it only touches the surface. The last page says this book could have, been over 1,000 pages long and touched all these other topics. But as I say, then it would have been self-published and no one would have read it. So, you have to confine yourself. So, honestly, the thing that comes to mind is I just enjoyed doing this because it was different. And I actually enjoyed writing things that might make some people feel uneasy about me. Yeah, it was nice not to care anymore, right? To be old enough not to care. That's really nice.
So so that there's like a character development thing then to be able to, okay. So what where's the best place for people to buy this book, just from your point of view? Is there a
Amazon? I assume there's a British. I know there's a British Amazon, just like an American Amazon, and it comes. You can get it overnight if you want to. You'll pay the Prime membership thing, but it's available. And Amazon.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on, and thank you for watching, everybody. If you leave a like for the video to help promote it, and leave a comment to let me know what you think, and then maybe in future, if you write a sequel to this book, or maybe I think it'd be interesting to do one on universalism at some point on your book when night comes, or
night comes. Yeah. Okay.
So maybe we could do that at some point. Awesome.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me.